the mind emerges from the brain. In other words, the brain causes the mind. For some scientists, that's kind of the end of the story. That's all you need to know. If you take that viewpoint, then the question of the origin of free will comes up. In other words, if all you have is this brain that creates the mind, then what is the origin of free will? How are we free to make our own choices? Some scientists have decided that since free will appears to be inconsistent with their view of science, that maybe free will doesn't even exist.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got another great show in store for today. Today, we are going to talk about the broad topic of consciousness, but perhaps more specifically getting into the science of consciousness. Our guest is Paul Nunez. He's an emeritus professor of biomedical engineering at Tulane University. He's the owner of Cognitive Dissonance, a consulting firm that specializes in brain research, and is the author of multiple books, including Brain, Mind, and the Structure of Reality, and his most recent book, The New Science of Consciousness, exploring the complexity of brain, mind, and self. Really excited to have him on the show today. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're very delighted to have you. You take on a very big task, obviously, not only in your book, but it seems like in your life's work. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you and drew you to explore consciousness this way?
Well, I got my PhD in engineering physics many years ago, and I was interested in that field. But I met a well-known neurologist at a party in San Diego, and he invited me to come to his lab and become a neuroscientist. And so that's what I did.
So, I mean, your book... Your most recent book, The New Science of Consciousness, I mean, it takes on what is a very big topic, a very big question. I see too, like in most conversations, to dive into it, you kind of have to define the terms. But here, defining the term kind of is the big topic. Like, how do we define consciousness? Where is it from? What does it come from? It's a big task. And in your book, you talk a lot about the easy problem and the hard problem. So I figured that might be a good place to start. What are the, as you define, the easy problems or the hard problem when it comes to consciousness?
Yes, well, for many years, neuroscientists have studied the so-called easy problem. It's not really that easy, but that term refers to the correlations between brain activity measured in various ways and the way we behave, or the kinds of things that we're thinking about, or whether we're recognizing a face, or all kinds of different mental tasks. And we call these the conscious correlates or signatures of consciousness. One example would be electroencephalography, or the so-called brain waves. Another would be functional magnetic resonance imaging, in which some parts of the brain tend to light up when you're doing certain tasks. And there are many other examples. In contrast to the so-called easy problem, the hard problem is the nature of consciousness itself. Where does it come from? As you alluded to in your first statements, we can't even define consciousness very well except in circular arguments. We might define consciousness in terms of awareness, for example, or even self-awareness, but it ends up being a circular definition.
You've mentioned neuroscience and also in the context of the easy problem of kind of defining some of these aspects of it. But neuroscience has really changed what we know of the brain. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how our collective understanding of the brain has changed in the last 10 to 15 years because of all these great developments in neuroscience.
Well, one way to describe this is to say that in the old days, people tended to think of the brain as what I call the Christmas lights brain. If you imagine a Christmas tree, and it has certain light patterns on it, and if you do a certain thing or perform a certain task, certain parts of the brain light up, and that view of the brain is still around, but the new views are much more related to looking at the brain as what we call in science a complex system, in which many different kinds of patterns are occurring that are connecting one part of the brain to the other. Much like perhaps a good example is a weather system. If you think of a weather map, the weather around the Earth and storms here in some parts of the world and other weather events taking places in different parts of the world, it would be some sort of dynamic pattern changing. And our consciousness is very much connected to these dynamic patterns. And this view is not entirely inconsistent with the Christmas tree brain or Christmas lights brain, but it's much more advanced and satisfying view.
In your recent book, you kind of blend a lot of this conversation and the dialogue between neuroscientists and, as you just mentioned, the complexity scientists. When it comes to this easy problem of the more physical side of this conversation of what consciousness is, what is it that we're learning today? Like, what is your research come? How does learning more about the brain acting like a Christmas tree in some ways, or even discuss like the difference between bottom up and top down interactions? How are these sorts of things, or what are these things teaching us about consciousness?
Well, again, it's a matter of looking at these different dynamic patterns. For example, consider some part of the brain. Let's just call it part A. It doesn't matter what it is, and part B. If you're looking at if you're recognizing a face, or if you are carrying out some particular mental calculation, parts A and B of the brain will be what we call functionally connected to each other. By that we mean that knowing something about the activity in part A will tell you something about the activity in part B. So we refer to that as a functional connection between A and B. But there are many different kinds of measures and different kinds of patterns that can be obtained with different experimental techniques. But each one has its own strengths and weaknesses, and applies only to a narrow spatial or temporal scale.
So what then with the work that you do, how do you then approach the hard problems, so to speak? We can look at the differences that are coming, or the things that are coming through with the physical sciences and the neuroscience. But how do you, with the work that you do, approach this hard problem of, well, what really is it? I mean, this is something that's often held in the realms of philosophers, and you do a wonderful job of addressing this also within the container of your work. So could you tell us a little bit more about your approach to the hard problem?
Well, in terms of the origins of consciousness, there are only, it seems to me, a few possibilities. One is what I would call the mainstream scientific view, which is that the mind emerges from the brain. In other words, the brain causes the mind. And for some scientists, that's kind of the end of the story. That's all you need to know. But if you take that viewpoint, then the question of the origin of free will comes up. In other words, if all you have is this brain that creates the mind, then what is the origin of free will? How are we free to make our own choices? And some scientists have decided that since free will appears to be inconsistent with their view of science, then maybe free will doesn't even exist.
And what's your belief there? You believe that free will does exist?
I do believe that free will exists. I don't think we are able to explain it at this point. But another view of consciousness is that it interacts with some external entity, which could be some informational-based entity that affects the way the brain develops, and therefore perhaps is the origin of free will. But we know very little about that, and science doesn't have much to say about that, except in my book I've tried to show, I've tried to follow different speculative tracks, all of which are potentially consistent with known science, but that doesn't mean we've really explained much of anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned your book, and I want to mention as well to our listeners that the book, not only being just a fascinating read for anyone that's interested in consciousness and these realms of neuroscience and things like that, but it does a really great job. It's a very complex topic, and at times the language being used, I mean, it has to be at a certain place of complexity just to talk about this very complex subject. But one of the things that I really appreciated about your book is at the end of each chapter, you have summaries of the information. So some of the things as I was going through, and I'm like, man, the author is obviously a lot more intelligent than I am. I'm a little lost. And then all of a sudden I've got this lifeboat of the summary at the end. That's like, oh, okay. I kind of get what he was saying with there. So I really appreciate that about your book.
Well, thank you very much. And I tried hard to explain things with as many metaphors and analogies as I could. One of the central themes of the book is complex systems. I've tried to explain that idea in terms of sociological systems, because that's something that everybody's familiar with. We have social networks that exist that are overlapping and are affected by top-down influences. For example, I've used the analogy of individuals forming cities and cities forming nations, and the nations having top-down effects like wars and economic conditions that act down on individuals. And then these individuals can then act back on the global system. And it appears to me that the correlates of consciousness, the signatures of consciousness that we study, are very much connected to this idea of top-down and bottom-up interactions.
So, in your book, you're covering a lot of these various topics about consciousness, and you were mentioning before about how the different views of where the mind emerges from, and how we don't. You've got this sort of materialist side that says, okay, the brain. The brain is the source of the mind, or something physical in that sense creates the mind. The mind emerges out of the brain, but then we don't really have the mechanisms yet to describe something more. One of the situations you gave is perhaps some sort of higher source of information or otherwise is what interacts and allows this. Aside from all the research that you've done, and I imagine someone who's so grounded in science, it might be a difficult thing or a challenge to articulate, just given the nature of it. But what is your belief about where all this goes? Where does the mind come from in your belief? I mean, there might not be the ability to point to the data yet, but what's your hypothesis? Like, what do you personally work towards? Where do you think this is all coming from?
Well, my approach to this has been to say, let's assume that what we know about, let's assume that consciousness fits in, not that this consciousness is explained by current science, but let's assume that consciousness, whatever the origin of it is consistent with today's understanding of science. Now, for some people, that's too constrictive, perhaps, but in my book, I've tried to point out that it's not nearly as restrictive as many people think. In other words, within our current views of science, there's a whole range of speculative and strange things that could be occurring that don't actually violate current scientific thinking.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yes. Again, well, let's just take modern physics, for example. Probably the readers have heard something about all the mysterious things that happen in quantum mechanics, where there's different interpretations of what's going on in these physics experiments, but common to all the explanations is some sort of hidden reality, some sort of a ghost world or shadow world that we don't have direct interactions with, but nevertheless affects the everyday world of our senses. So it's completely consistent that there would be other kinds of, there would be several kinds of shadow world or hidden reality behind the things that we can see that could be a part of the explanation for consciousness.
Yet we can't actually verify those particular things yet. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. They're beyond current science, but nevertheless we know they're there. Perhaps the readers, perhaps the listeners have heard of the terms dark energy and dark matter. Mm-hmm. These are phenomena that we have no explanation for at this time, but because of the way they affect the observable universe, we know that they're actually there somewhere. Hmm.
Switching gears just a little bit in terms of some of the more physical sciences that you've worked within and researched, what has your work taught you about conditions like autism and schizophrenia and Alzheimer's?
Well, there's a number of things. Let me point out that the brain consists of the cerebral cortex, which is the so-called gray matter, which is about the thickness of about a 5-cent coin. It covers most of the entire surface of the brain. And underneath that gray matter is a white matter layer, which consists of connecting cables connecting different parts of the cortex to other parts of the cortex, of the cerebral cortex. And one of the most interesting things that's happened just in the last few years is a lot of these diseases, including autism and as well as schizophrenia and many other brain disorders, have been associated with deficits in the white matter, the connections between different parts of the cortex. If you can imagine some sort of electric circuit or any kind of system which consists of different elements and connections between these different elements, one can think if that system goes wrong, that it could be that the individual elements in the system go wrong, as in damage, for example, to the cerebral cortex, or it could be damage to the connecting wires that link all these different sections together. And the most recent evidence is that a lot of these diseases are, in fact, due to the damage or underdevelopment of the connecting wires, connecting these different parts of the brain to each other.
And so then with science, and I know that they're developing. I was actually pretty shocked to see when I was reading your book, you mentioned a former student of yours, Brett, who's now the founder of Halo Sport. I actually just recently started a trial with Halo Sport's device, which is working to stimulate the motor cortex specifically. I'm working with it in the realm of yoga and range of motion, flexibility, things like that. But it was one of those moments like, oh, it's a really wonderful small world because of that connection. But the point being that we've not only through devices are learning new ways to perhaps approach problems like that, but also finding ways not only to bring us to a baseline if we're in a deficit, but actually finding ways to optimize and increase brain function. Can you talk a little bit about, just in terms of your knowledge of both, I mean, maybe it's in the realm of nootropins or devices like the one with your former student, Brett, utilizing, where are we going? Like how are we starting to support this, and where does it go next?
Well, yes, I think this various kinds of electrical stimulation of the brain for various purposes has a bright future. It turns out that Brett was just visited me a few weeks ago and brought his device so that I could try it out.
Awesome. It's literally like sitting right next to me right now.
Okay. That's good. But this is just one area. This is supposed to, this is an area where this is an application of electrical stimulation, which is just a matter of putting on this device, which has a number of electrodes that passes very small amounts of current through the brain. And his first application is to use this in sports to improve people's performance. I've been tempted to try it and improve my tennis game, for example, which needs a lot of improvement. But this has a great potential for, and one obvious area would be stroke victims. It may well be that by using this electrical stimulation that you could speed up the recovery of stroke victims. Another area which I don't think has been tried very much, but has potential, would be in people in deep coma, to use electrical stimulation to see if you might bring them out of that state of even out of a vegetative state or what they call a minimally conscious state. So that's certainly a big area that's barely been tapped.
So when it comes to your work and all the research that you do, I mean, obviously there's education and just teaching people about all the latest research out there and data that's out there. But what would you say is your ultimate hope or goal with the research that you've done, with the work? Like, where do you see this hopefully moving towards?
Well, I think some of the things I mentioned, but in addition to that, I think the whole area of mental illness is ripe for new developments. As I'm sure most listeners will know, that our understanding of mental diseases is very limited. We use different drugs, which are often effective, but we have only a minimal idea of how how those drugs actually work. They work on the neurotransmitters in some way, but the details are not understood. And so in a lot of cases, it's just a matter of developing new drugs and trying them out and seeing how they work. And in the kind of work that I'm doing, we're hoping to shed a lot more light on how these various drugs work on when addressing mental illness, so that they can be much more directed towards the specific deficits that people are suffering from. I could use this analogy, a rough analogy that I used in the book, which is of a football stadium full of football fans. And we could think of the state of the football fans as kind of analogous to the state of the brain. And suppose a touchdown is scored and a large portion of the fans in the stadium are all yelling together. We could call that a state of global coherence. The whole system is kind of acting all together. At the other extreme would be the case where the only thing that's going on between the people are individual conversations at different parts of the stand. We could call that a state of extreme localization. And a lot of these diseases seem to be diseases in which one is too far in one direction or the other. In other words, healthy brains seem to operate at the midpoint between extreme localization and extreme global coherence. For example, schizophrenia might be appears to be a disease where there is not sufficient integration between different parts of the brain. So that would be a state of extreme localization. Whereas somebody in a coma might be at the other extreme, in this extreme state of globalization, analogous to the case where all the fans are yelling together. These various drugs operate on the neurotransmitters, which determine where along the spectrum of local to global behavior, where the brain ends up, depending upon the various drugs that are used.
And where would you say the average person falls into this conversation? So we're talking about specific brain conditions and extremes of these things. If we were to take your research and kind of apply it to someone who perhaps they don't have a dysfunction within their brain itself, but they have a standard operating system, so to speak, how can they start to take this emerging field of through neuroscience and this understanding of the science of consciousness and apply it into their lives? Are there things that they can be doing to help optimize brain function that help in this way that you know of? Like what can the average person do with this?
Yes, well, I think, of course, there are many people working on autism, for example, and I'm not closely familiar with all this work, but I know a lot of it has to do with engaging people in more social interactions. In other words, somebody who's not autistic, but maybe is a little bit on the autism spectrum, could be somebody who tends to focus inwardly all the time. And these various methods of engaging people in more complex social situations, it seems to me to be an effective way of training people and having them learn to move their brains along the spectrum more closely to sort of an optimum state of between these extremes.
You mentioned social networks a little bit earlier, and you mentioned your book as well. With what you just said in mind, What are your feelings based on sort of in-person human interaction versus things like social media, and perhaps then their effect on the brain? Because the way we see people interact on social media, for example, is not the same way that people will interact if they are face-to-face with a group of people. Some weird things start to happen. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, well, I don't know. The one thing that flashes on my mind are listening to tapes of people. I was thinking right now the famous Nixon tapes, and trying to follow, just listening to what people said without having all the social cues that you get from looking at somebody's face when they're talking, how difficult it is to really follow what's going on with only the words and not the and a lot of the emotional content associated with facial expressions and body language and all those things are missing. So it seems to me that, and I guess people are have become very much in tune with the fact that when they send an email message, it can sound awfully abrupt and and in some cases insulting to the other person, because it's done without the emotional cues that people are accustomed to in face-to-face interactions.
And does this get rectified just with technology and everyone eventually starting to do video messages instead of emails, do you think? Or how does that get resolved, I wonder?
Well, I think that, of course, if you're sending video, it helps quite a bit. I'm not sure it's quite the same. If you're not physically close to somebody, a lot of conversations, particularly in other cultures, involve physical exchanges between people, touching. Somebody tells a joke and pats you on the shoulder or whatever. I think those kinds of things are very important. Tactile interactions.
So in terms of the research that you've done, would you encourage people to get off social media a little bit more and spend some more time interacting with people in their neighborhood?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Well, I mean, this topic itself is one, obviously, that not only has been drawn out through all of human history, obviously, but it's something that I'm even just diving into one small section of your book, we could spend multiple podcasts on, I'm sure. So, I think that the introduction itself is a great intro for people that want to dive more into this and obviously then get into your book. I want to, if you'll permit me, I want to take advantage of having someone that is as skilled in their understanding of the brain as you. And there's a section in your book where you talk beautifully about the rhythms of the brain and the various frequencies and kind of what some of this stuff means and resonance and all this stuff. Being in the community that I am, the things like binaural beats are a big thing in terms of working with brainwave frequencies and such. Given your connection to hard data and the sciences, what are your opinions on like isochronic and binaural beats to affect brainwave patterns in people?
I'm sorry, I'm not really familiar with that.
Oh, okay. Well, then that's okay too. There's so the idea behind it is that to get, like, you'll talk about the alpha brain waves, delta, gamma, so on and so forth. And the idea is that they'll send various pulses via sound to the brain and using entrainment. So let's say you want to get down to a 7 hertz. The ear can't hear that, but so what they do is they'll play 100 hertz in one ear, 107 in the other, and your brain entrains to that space in the middle of 7.
Oh, okay. Now I understand. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the science behind it. I mean, with things like that, there's always claims of this thing and that. And someone that when I was reading that section in your book, I was very much like, ooh, I wonder, what he thinks about this. But it's fair enough that if you're not familiar with the specifics of it.
Well, there could be something to it. But let me talk a little bit more generally about these rhythms and what their importance is. Everybody has these brain rhythms. If if you don't produce these rhythms, you're dead, because electrical activity from the brain is one of the tests for brain death. So you definitely need these rhythms. And going back to my analogy of the football stadium, healthy brains seem to require a certain amount of interaction between the rest of the brain, but not too much. It has to be in an intermediate stage. And the question of how different parts of the brain can be what we call semi-autonomous. In other words, operate somewhat independently of the rest of the brain, but at the same time be integrated in some other ways. It turns out that this seems to be accomplished by resonant interactions of these different frequencies that occur in different parts of the brain and at different scales of the brain, by spatial scales. By spatial scales, I mean organizational levels, ranging from the whole brain down to single neurons.
And so these frequencies are important in our daily lives, or they're pointing towards what exactly in our daily lives? Well, they're
needed in order. Again, they're needed to produce a healthy consciousness, which again requires this combination of integration and localization of different parts of the brain. In other words, different parts of the brain do different things, so they have to be somewhat isolated. At the same time, they have to be integrated in order to produce a single integrated consciousness. And diseases like schizophrenia, as I've said earlier, very much indicate brains in which this integration is not properly carried out.
Well, I'm listening to you and thinking about all the very physical side of things. Where do you place things like psychiatry and whatnot in this overall dialogue? When I heard you say like integrated consciousness, I think of these people that are working towards revealing these aspects of our subconscious that go unrecognized and unnoticed and things like that. Where does that fit into this type of research and conversation?
Well, yeah, as one of my colleagues said to me, half joking, psychiatrists love things that they don't understand, which has some truth to it, I think, because psychiatrists have a very difficult problem because they're dealing with a very complex system that nobody really understands very well. We just have very limited understanding. So. Again, one of the psychiatrist's tools, certainly not the only one, but is these various drugs that affect the neurotransmitters. And I've hoped with my book that I've given some hints, not solved any problems, but given some hints as to what psychiatrists might be looking to do with these various kinds of illnesses.
One final question for you, in just the big broad spectrum. I mean, it's outside the realm of the nuts and bolts of the conversation, but with all the work that you do in the realm of consciousness, do you think that one day humans will be able to create consciousness?
I don't think so, or at least I don't think it's going to happen in the near future. I think, however, that what will happen is that we will create robots that fool a lot of people. That from most observations will be very, very difficult to tell that they're not conscious, but they won't actually be conscious. In philosophy, these kinds of creatures would be called zombies, philosophical zombies. And the reason I think that this is a long way off is because the actual creation of consciousness may require that we actually duplicate physically the same systems that occur in real brains, which means down to even the smallest scales. Now, if you think of even a single cell, a single neuron, consists of maybe 10 billion interacting molecules. Even a single cell is more complex than our biggest or strongest computer these days. So to create those people who think that robots can be made conscious are assuming that they can create a physical system that's much less complex than the actual brain, and therefore will produce consciousness. And I think this is unlikely. I think it's a big stretch.
Well, I'm sure that's good news to the people that are worried about AI taking over the world in a Skynet Terminator type situation happening anytime soon. So at least that's whew, like we're off the hook on that one, hopefully, when it comes to that. Paul, I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. It opens up conversations both within that realm of philosophy, which is a realm that I'm much more comfortable in talking about consciousness, and it blends it with the science behind it, not just neuroscience, but all these other physical sciences that really work to help understand and explain what consciousness is or may be. And so I'm really grateful for the work that you do. I encourage everyone to go and check out your book. It is available, The New Science of Consciousness, Exploring the Complexity of Brain, Mind, and Self. If you could do us a favor, let us know, Paul, what's the best way to get in touch with you, best place to get your book, find out about further work that you're doing or projects that you have?
Yes, well, it's available on Amazon and Prometheus Books and Barnes & Noble. And, I'm having a regular blog on Psychology Today, which a new one will occur every month or so.
Awesome.
And I'm on Facebook under an assumed name, Scott Spade. And I'm on LinkedIn.
Why may I ask why under the assumed name?
Because I wrote an historical novel under that name, and I started the Facebook page to promote my novel.
All right, I'll have to look into that one. I love it. Awesome. Well, Paul/Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot. And again, I hope they find out more about you, check out your books and the work that you're doing. And we'll link to the Psychology Today page as well in the show notes for everybody. So everybody, thank you so much for listening today. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannahEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.